Well, we want to talk about the eldership, and some of you know a lot about the topic. Others haven't heard as much about it, but I want to at least give you an introduction to it and answer what tends to be the basic questions that come up. And so hopefully I will cover that as we go. But let's click up the slide thing there, Marcel, if you'll do that. Marcel is my slide guy. Okay, so elders are working qualifications. Click to the next, please. There are three. You got me there, Marcel? Next. Okay, so there are three basic words for this particular role. We usually just use the one elder, and it comes from a Greek term that simply means older. And then you have, back up one, please. Then you have a second word that simply means shepherd. It's normally always translated that way in the newer versions, at least. It is translated one time in the NIV as pastor, and the old word was pastor, but shepherd's the better translation. So a shepherd, as we would know in a regular life situation, would be someone that took care of the sheep, led them to the right place to eat, watched over them to keep them from being hurt in any way. The third term is simply the one next. Slide, please. The third term is a word that simply means overseer, and it's normally translated that way. It's actually the word episkopos, but it means looking over someone or taking care of someone. The difference in a shepherd and an overseer is really not that much. I tend to look at it with a shepherd being someone that is the day-to-day in your life, helping you in a particular problem you're facing, etc. An overseer I would tend to see as more of a strategic look, trying to take care of the flock as a whole and plan for the future and that sort of thing. So they're closely related, but I think each of them carries a bit different idea. One is more taking care of someone on the spot, and the other is to kind of look at the future and look at the whole flock and have a plan. I found out that elders, I've been an elder, by the way, in Boston for a lot of years and in Phoenix for a number of years, maybe 20 years total. But I found out that most of us that have served in that role tend to be a little stronger as a shepherd or a little stronger as an overseer. And that's why I think a plurality of elders is the biblical example. Okay, next slide. Well, Marcel's having the same problem here that I had when I was trying to do it. But the next scriptures are several different ones that just talk about the function of elders. And so in Acts 20:28, keep watch over yourselves and all the flock of which the Holy Spirit has made you overseers. Be shepherds of the church of God, which he bought with his own blood. And so you've got overseer, shepherd mentioned here a few verses earlier. It tells us that Paul got with the elders from the Ephesus church in the location of Miletus. And so he simply says, take care of yourself, make sure the flock is doing well, and that is the charge of an elder. He's focused in on the flock itself. I've often looked at the Great Commission as a two-part commission. One is to go and make disciples of all nations, and then teaching them to observe everything that Christ has commanded. And so the first part is more the evangelization. The second part is the maturing process, but the shepherding role would fit well into that second part. In Ephesians 4, he says it was some, he, Jesus, who gave some to be apostles, some to be prophets, some to be evangelists, some to be pastors and teachers, to prepare God's people for works of service so that the body of Christ may be built up. So all of the leadership of the church shares the role of helping train people and mature people so that they are about the work of the church. It's not the role of the leaders to do all of the work. It is to train us so that the whole flock together does the work in both evangelizing and maturing and discipling and helping each other. Okay, next slide. Well, we'll get to it in a minute. I've got a note here I can look at. The next one is actually 1 Timothy 5. I've got part of that up there, not all of it, but it says the elders who direct the affairs of the church well are worthy of double honor, especially those whose work is preaching and teaching. For the scripture says to not muzzle the ox while it is treading out the grain, and the worker deserves his wages. So when he talks about double honor here, he explains that by describing paying or supporting someone. And so that talks, I think, about having elders that are on staff, like Jeho is, and it mentions that they direct the affairs of the church, but it's a dual role sometimes. And I have served as a teacher and elder at the same time. I have served as an elder and evangelist at the same time. And so he talks about the possibility of a double role and also the possibility of an elder being supported by the church to do what he does. He mentions the elders directing the affairs of the church. That one I elaborate a lot more on in a book that I wrote called Dynamic Leadership. It's a fairly in-depth book on church leadership. I would recommend that you actually get that because it covers all of the different leadership roles in the church, or most all of them, and has, I think, some very important teaching in it. But people wonder, what does it mean the elders direct the affairs of the church? Sometimes people have had the idea that the elders ought to be the sole ones who sort of oversee and direct the church as far as its future and all of that. I've never subscribed to that as an elder or as an evangelist or a teacher. I think there needs to be a teamwork approach to things, but it simply means to lead or to manage. It doesn't mean that the elders try to do everything or make every decision, but it means that they have that overseeing role, and how they lead or how they manage will depend on the leadership that you have available and the group that's being led. And so that I elaborate a lot more on than I have time to do here. So next slide, if we can get to that one. I think this is 1 Peter coming up. And 1 Peter uses all three of the terms that we've talked about that are ascribed to the elders. Can you get to that one, Marcel?
Gordon, is screen's
Okay.
on, so you can just go ahead.
Do what?
Screen's
okay.
already on. Yeah, you can
Okay.
just go, yeah.
So maybe mine's slower, but he says, to the elders among you, I appeal as a fellow elder. And so Peter was in the dual role of being an apostle as well as an elder. He says, a witness of Christ's sufferings and one who will also share in the glory to be revealed. Be shepherds of God's flock that is under your care, serving as overseers, not because you must, but because you're willing, as God wants you to be. Not greedy for money, but eager to serve, not lording it over those entrusted to you, but being examples to the flock. And when the chief shepherd appears, you'll receive the crown of glory that will never fade away. And so this one, like some of the other passages we looked at, combines all three of the terms, elder, shepherd, and overseer. And it's the same role. We could call elders shepherds just as well as we call them elders, but we seem to always stick to the elder terminology. Okay, next slide, please. In this one, we get down to the qualifications, as we usually call it, and these are found, I did not quote these, but these are found in 1 Timothy chapter 3 and Titus chapter 1. They are very, very similar. They're different in a few ways that I will talk about, but we usually call these qualifications. And how should we think about these? I think we tend to look at them as a checklist. And some people say it helps if we call them qualities rather than qualifications. It does suggest, I think, something different to some people. And the checklist idea, I don't think is what Paul is really getting at here. And I don't think a legalistic approach is the best way to look at it. I was in a discussion one time about a given person and his qualifications to be an elder. And he had children that were natural born children, and they were all very faithful disciples and doing great. And they had an adopted son who was not adopted until he was near a teenager, might have been. And he did not become a disciple. And so there were certain ones that said, well, the elder is not qualified because this adopted son did not get baptized. And my comments that night, my blood pressure got raised considerably, by the way, but my comments were, James said that we are to care for the orphans and the widows. And here you have someone that's done that, and you want to say that he's not qualified to be an elder simply because he adopted a son who was older and did not have the benefit of being around the church at all in his early years, far from it. So the legalistic approach is not how I want to approach it. Ultimately, what we're trying to do with any leadership role is identify people with certain types of leadership gift sets. In Romans chapter 12, it mentions leadership as a gift. And yet within the leadership gift set, you have those that are teacher types, you have those that are elder types, those that are evangelist types, etc., all under that banner of leadership. And so to me, the focus is not on how and when that gift set was gained, but whether it's now present. All I want to know mainly is a person in possession of these different qualities that will allow him to be a good shepherd, a good elder, a good overseer. How he developed them and when he developed them, there are a number of possibilities. I mean, obviously, back in the first century, how are you going to know about parenting? Well, you got to have kids, and that's always going to be true. But we have other avenues that people learn a lot of principles in that apply to dealing with people. There are many majors in college now that I'm sure in the first century they had nothing like it. And so there are ways, I think, that people learn different people leading qualities that isn't necessarily just within the family, but in the first century, that was the main way that it was going to happen. I'll say more about that one in a moment. But switch over to the next slide. What I've done is just listed all of the different individual qualities that an elder is to have based on those two passages, Titus 1 and 1 Timothy chapter 3. But I do want to mention this before I get to those. This is a quote out of my book, Dynamic Leadership. A mature friend of mine, it happened to be Wyndham Shaw, who left us 6 months ago. But Wyndham made this statement back in the early part of this century when we were going through a lot of big challenges. He says, as a movement, we have had impossibly high qualifications for elders and unbelievably low qualifications for evangelists. His statement certainly contains some truth, although I hope it was intended as a hyperbole, an overstatement. And then I put in there, don't get offended, evangelists, because Wyndham served as many years as an evangelist. His son-in-law is an evangelist in the Boston church right now. Certainly neither Wyndham or I are negative at all about evangelists, because we consider ourselves one of those, or certainly we've been that. But I end up by saying, therefore, I am open to a re-examination of my long-held views regarding elder qualifications. I'm not open to lowering the spiritual standards for the men who serve in this role, but it seems to me that the spiritual standard is not about past history. It is about current spirituality. And that will become important in a moment when we talk about family qualifications. Okay, next slide. What I've done is gone to those two passages in Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3 and taken the qualifications or the qualities, and I broke them down into some categories just to make it easy. So I've got everything that these two passages say, but I've got them listed as individual qualities. One is what I call personality and character qualities: temperate, self-controlled, hospitable, disciplined, not violent but gentle, not quarrelsome, not overbearing, and not quick-tempered. So those are what I would call personality and character qualities. And I think they're fairly self-explanatory, right? We know if someone is overbearing. We know if they've got a temper problem. We know what kind of lifestyle they have, if they're disciplined and hospitable and all of that. But these are personality and character qualities. Okay, next slide. This lists what I would call very direct spiritual qualities, not a recent convert. And he talks about that. He said a recent convert could become prideful if they have a role like this, because it is a very influential role. Loves what is good, is holy, is upright. These are what I would classify as more direct spiritual qualities. And then the next part of the list would be qualities that have to do with one's reputation. He mentioned specifically good reputation with outsiders, or else he may fall into disgrace. And so certainly we would want someone to be known on the job, in the neighborhood, etc. We'd want them to be someone with a very good reputation. Someone who's respectable, someone who is above reproach, someone who is blameless. That doesn't mean sinless, by the way, but it just means someone that is has a reputation that they are very solid disciples, righteous people, etc. Not given to drunkenness, and not a lover of money. And then the last one there is not pursuing dishonest gain, that ties into the lover of money. So those are just a way to break those down and look at them in different categories. But basically, it is someone who is living as a disciple, someone that has an example that is very commendable as a disciple, and they are in control of their emotions and relate well to people and all of that. Then the next part of the list, go to the next slide, is about teaching skills. An elder should be someone who is able to teach. It doesn't necessarily mean that they have a teaching gift. I know the elders that are great teachers. I know others that are not as effective, but they are able to teach. They can definitely teach the basics, get in front of the flock, teach some things that the church needs to know and do, etc. It says holds firmly to the trustworthy message, and it mentions able to encourage others by sound doctrine, sound teaching, healthy teaching, and to refute those who oppose it. And so that is one of the duties of an elder, is when people are teaching false things, he's got to be able to, number one, recognize it, and then he's got to be willing to stand up against it and refute it. And so elders have to have the courage to be able to handle some opposition and to make sure that God's word is upheld. I just posted on Facebook a few moments ago an article about a fellow elder that I served with in Phoenix. He died a month ago tomorrow. His name was Jerry Jones. And I wrote an article about him called Jerry Jones, a Man of Steel and Velvet. And he was a great elder. He was a teddy bear who loved people and was loved by people. But when it came down to dealing with false teaching and false teachers, he did not blink. He would deal with it. And you might want to read that little article, because Jerry to me was a great example of an elder. He and I went through a lot of battles together and did a lot of serving together. It was great. Now, the next part is where a lot of questions come up, and I've gone through the other fairly fast in order to be able to explain this one more fully, because typically when you talk about certain leadership possibilities, there are always some questions that people immediately jump to. For example, whether you're aware of it or not, it's being discussed in our movement of churches about the woman's role. Can she do more than she is doing in our churches? And when I have written about it or taught about it, people always jump to one thing, and that is, can she be an evangelist or an elder? I mean, we always have these things that we jump to immediately. On the elder side of the river here, when we talk about leadership or talk about the qualities of an elder, people immediately want to know, well, what about this? Husband of but one wife, manages his own family well. These are all directly taken from Titus 1 and 1 Timothy 3. Sees that his children obey him with proper respect. And that's what 1 Timothy 3 says. Titus adds this one: his children believe and are not open to the challenge of being wild and disobedient. So let's go to the husband of one wife, next slide, and let's talk about what that means. And to me, in order to talk about what it means, we're going to have to take a look at what it meant in the original setting of the first centuries. We look at the personality and character qualities, the spiritual qualities, the reputation qualities. Those, I think, are fairly self-evident. But when it comes down to the question about family, the husband of but one wife, what does that mean and why is it here? Next slide. Typically, we have had different ways of looking at what it means to be the husband of but one wife. If you take the real strict interpretation, and there are some, I was raised in a part of the what I call the mainstream Church of Christ. I was raised in a setting where they said if someone had a divorce and remarriage before they're a Christian, then that disqualifies them from ever being an elder. And so what they did as a non-Christian regarding marriage can disqualify someone from ever becoming an elder. There are people in our movement that have taught that. Some may still teach it. I've never believed it, but even when I was supposed to believe it, and I'll explain why. On the other end, it has to mean something. We can't just throw it out altogether. So we can't, in my judgment, be legalistic on one end or basically dismiss it on the other end. Those are extremes. But my question is, what was it like in the Roman world in the first century? Well, it was a very immoral place. And it was very, very common for people before they became Christians to go to the local temples, and a part of their worship was to worship a fertility goddess and to go in and have sex in the temple. That was just common. It was a very immoral place. So to be a one-woman man, which is literally what the Greek says, a one-woman man, I don't think it meant in the first century that someone had been married only one time, because a lot of people that were married maybe only one time were sleeping around in that particular setting. I asked the question, what is America like at this time? Back when the very strict interpretation was so popular in my earlier days, people didn't have sex outside marriage openly. It was usually in the back seat of the car at the drive-in or some other place, but they didn't just live together. That was odd. Even very non-Christian types didn't do that much back when I was a younger guy. And so it was easy to say, well, if someone has been married and divorced, that disqualifies them because marriage and divorce wasn't near like it is in our day. But what's America like at this time? Well, many people live together without being married. Many people, live with someone and then they decide that's not a good one, and so they live with someone else. And you have people with multiple habitations through the years that may never get married. And so picture this, if you will. You've got one guy and he sleeps around all the time and doesn't get married at all. He just sleeps around a lot for a number of years, and then he gets converted. And after he gets converted, he decides that's a sin and he can't do that anymore. And he meets a sister and they get married. And he's only been married one time, but he's got a terribly immoral past. And then you got another guy that had an early marriage. It was not a wise choice. It didn't work out, but he was not nearly as wild in his morality as the other guy. But now some would say, well, he can still never be an elder because he had a marriage that went the wrong way as a young person. So to me, in the first century and now, I would define a one-woman man as someone who is faithful to his wife. And so in the first century, that would have been something fairly rare. A man had only one woman that he slept with. That would be fairly rare. And in America, given our immoral setting at this time, when you have someone that is faithful to their wife, that is a one-woman man in my judgment. So I think the Roman world tells us something about what it would mean now. And so why is it listed? Well, people that are elders are going to be helping marriages and counseling marriages. And if they don't have a personal example that's a good example, then they're not going to be very effective as an elder. And so what I'm always looking for is not what happened to someone when they're non-Christians. It's odd to me on this particular point that we look back at someone that's committed every sin in Galatians 5 and other passages, and now they're converted, and we look at their past and say, God is so amazing. Look how much they have changed. Look at the miracles God has done in their life, and we're so encouraged by the life changes that they've made. We don't go back and look at what they were many years ago or decades ago. And so my question is, why go back and look at that on the marriage issue of what somebody did before they became a Christian? It'd be the only thing that we do like that. It makes no sense to me. And so that's my thought on it. There are people that disagree with that, but I don't see why. When you're looking for someone who is qualified to be a shepherd, their past is hardly the issue, it seems to me. I went over that fast, but I hope that made sense to you, because my question is not what they did before they're a Christian. My question is, what are they doing now? And are they a one-woman man? Are they faithful to their mate? And do they have a good marriage that is an example that can be used as a counsel and help other disciples? So this is a quality or a qualification that has been much debated among us, but that's my thought about it. I've been around, dealt with this for a really long time, and I think if you look at the cultural setting then and now, my explanation of it makes the most sense. At least it does to me. So that's something for you to think about and continue to study about. Okay, next slide. The next topic here that we discuss has to do with the children. And so it's notable, I think, that Timothy and Titus both say it a little different way. Timothy says he must manage his own family well and see that his children obey him with proper respect. And then he explains why. If anyone does not know how to manage his own family, if he's not a good parent, how can he parent God's family? Is kind of the question there. That's what Timothy says. He doesn't say anything about them being believers. And you wonder a little about that, by the way, but I'll talk about that in a moment. In Titus 1:6, it says, an elder must be blameless, the husband of but one wife, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. So one question is, why does Timothy mention one thing or Paul mention to Timothy one thing and to Titus something else? Titus says, a man whose children believe and are not open to the charge of being wild and disobedient. I think a valid question is, was the atmosphere or the environment enough different so that Paul felt like it was more a problem in Crete, where Titus was, than it was in Ephesus, where Timothy was? And if you read on a little further in Titus 1, he talks about the elders helping with the people that are teaching false doctrine and not doing well. And as he's talking about the people in Crete, where Titus was, he said, one of your own poets have said that Cretans are always liars and evil beasts and idle gluttons. And Paul says, and this charge is true. So the Cretans had quite a reputation. That wasn't a very politically correct comment about Cretans, but Paul was pretty blunt about it. But I've wondered if the reason Titus mentions more about the children not being wild and disobedient, if he mentions that specifically because the atmosphere in Crete was different than it was in Ephesus. It's a thought. I wouldn't try to base anything certain on it. But let's look at the phrase here about a man whose children believe. What does that mean, they believe? The word is pistos in the Greek. It's used more than 60 times in the New Testament. Mostly, overall, it's translated as trustworthy, reliable, or something like that, rather than, as we often use it, designating someone who is a Christian or a believer in that sense. Next slide. And so back in 2003, when we realized that, wow, we could have used a lot more elders to help in some of the challenges that we were going through, a lot of people went back and studied that and found out that that the word pistos didn't necessarily mean a believer, but it could mean someone who was reliable, trustworthy, basically showed good parenting. And so when you apply it to the pistos to humans, it's about equally divided to indicate someone who's reliable or trustworthy, or someone who is actually a disciple, a believer in that sense. It's about half and half when it's applied to humans. The same word is applied to sayings or to God or whatever. So the term pistos is applied to other settings besides humans, but among humans, it's about equally divided. And so it could be saying that they need to be good, upright people that are good in the family, and they're not wild and disobedient, which would certainly show not very good parenting. But I'm saying that it's not certain that it means that they are baptized believers. And so that was all restudied a lot, and people came to some different conclusions on it. I know that Boston, I had been an elder there for a long time. After I left at the end of 2003, they did a lot of restudy on this and decided that they wanted to interpret it that it meant more reliable or trustworthy rather than a baptized believer. And so they appointed an elder, a good friend of mine, who had one daughter that was in the church and one who wasn't. And so they decided, because he had a great relationship with the one that wasn't in the church, and she was certainly reliable, trustworthy, a good person, even though she wasn't a disciple, they felt like that qualified him. And so he served for a number of years there until he retired. So different churches came up to different places. My view on it is I could go either way on it. I've always leaned more toward it being someone whose children believe, in the sense of being a disciple. But on the other hand, I don't think it's certain. And I think since good brothers and sisters have studied that out and come to some different views on that, to me, I just want to look at each case individually, see what the family's really like. And basically, I want to know what Paul did, and that is, have they managed their own family well? And do those skills show up in a way that they can parent God's family and help take care of God's kiddos? I mentioned my own personal example in this, though I served as an elder. Much of what I learned about parenting skills, I learned in the church through the avenue of what I think was good discipling. I had a lot of good discipling, and I learned how to take care of God's kids. And many of the principles I teach in parenting now, I actually learned that through God's family. I wasn't nearly as good a father as I would like to have been when my children were small, especially. But I think I was qualified to be an elder because I think I have a lot of parenting skills. But I'm just saying many of those I did not learn in the physical family setting. I learned in another setting. So, bottom line, is a brother qualified to serve as an elder right now? Does he have those qualities? And not what has been his history, unless the reputation factor is involved. It's possible that you could have a family situation in which some things had happened that damaged the reputation to the point that it wouldn't be wise for them to serve as an elder, but that would have to be determined on a case-by-case history. And so my last question there, and this is my last slide, how do we view God's work in miraculous changes? We look back at someone who was totally immoral as a non-Christian. They were a piece of work in many, many areas, violated every sin in every sin list. And yet now we look at them and think, wow, what a miraculous change in them. And we are in awe of their spiritual life and can hardly believe they were once what they were. So again, my question is, why would we not look at marriage that way? Why would we not look at someone whose marriage after becoming a Christian has been exemplary? Why would we want to go back and, in my judgment, penalize someone for something that happened as a non-Christian? We don't do it in any other area. Why would we do it in that area? So that's my question. But that is the end of my particular presentation. I want to leave time for questions and answers. And let me say that this has been a very quick presentation because I did want to include the time for questions and answers. But the book, Dynamic Leadership, it goes into all this in much more detail. But those are some things that I wanted to at least plant some seeds on for you to have in mind as you do further study on it.